The Florida East Coast Railway is a Class II railroad operating in the U.S. state of Florida and since 2007 has been a subsidiary of Railroad Acquisition Holdings, LLC, itself a subsidiary of FOXX Investment Group, LLC. The FEC was historically a Class I railroad owned by Florida East Coast Industries from 2000 to 2006, FOXX Holdings from 1983 to 2000, and the St.Joseph Paper Company prior to 1983. Built primarily in the last quarter of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century, the FEC was a project of Standard Oil principal Henry Morrison Flagler. Flagler originally visited Florida to aid with the health issues faced by his first wife, Mary, a key strategist who worked closely with John D. Rockefeller building the Standard Oil Trust. Henry Flagler noted both a lack of services and great potential during his stay at St. Augustine. He subsequently began what amounted to his second career developing resorts, industries, and communities all along Florida's shores abutting the Atlantic Ocean. The FEC is possibly best known for building the railroad to Key West, completed in 1912, when the FEC's line from the mainland to Key West was heavily damaged by the Labor Day hurricane of 1935. The state of Florida purchased the remaining right-of-way and bridges south of Dade County, and they were rebuilt into road bridges for vehicle traffic and became known as the Overseas Highway. However, a greater and lasting Flagler legacy was the developments along Florida's eastern coast. During the Great Depression, control was purchased by heirs of the DuPont family. After 30 years of fragile financial condition, the FEC, under leadership of a new president, Ed Ball, took on the labor unions. Ball claimed the company could not afford the same costs as larger Class I railroads and needed to invest saved funds in its infrastructure, fast becoming a safety issue. Using replacement workers, the company and some of its employees engaged in one of the longest and more violent labor conflicts of the 20th century from 1963 until 1977. Ultimately, federal authorities had to intervene to stop the violence, which included bombings, shootings and vandalism. However, the courts ruled in the FEC's favor with regard to the right to employ strikebreakers. During this time, Ball invested heavily in numerous steps to improve its physical plant, installed various forms of automation, was the first U.S. railroad to operate two-man train crews, eliminate cabooses and end all of its passenger services by 1968. In modern times, the company's primary rail revenues come from its intermodal and rock trains. Since 2007, it has been owned by FOXX Investment Group, which acquired it for over $3 billion. FOXX previously owned conglomerate shortline railroad operator Rail America, which for a time operated FEC, but the two companies never merged. FOXX no longer owns Rail America, and Rail America no longer operates FEC. A former CSX official, James Hertwig, was named as president and chief executive officer of the company effective July 1, 2010. History. Henry Flagler, developing Florida's East Coast. The Florida East Coast Railway was developed by Henry Morrison Flagler, an American tycoon, real estate promoter, railroad developer and John D. Rockefeller's partner in Standard Oil. Formed at Cleveland, Ohio as Rockefeller, Andrews and Amp. Flagler in 1867. Standard Oil moved its headquarters in 1877 to New York City. Flagler and his family relocated there as well. He was joined by Henry H. Rogers, another leader of Standard Oil who also became involved in the development of America's railroads, including those on nearby Staten Island, the Union Pacific, and later in West Virginia, where he eventually built the remarkable Virginian Railway to transport coal to Hampton Roads, Virginia. Flagler's non-Standard Oil interests went in a different direction, however, when in 1878, on the advice of his physician, he traveled to Jacksonville, Florida for the winter with his first wife, Mary, who was quite ill. 2 years after she died in 1881, he married Mary's former caregiver, Ida Alice Schurz. After the wedding, the couple traveled to St. Augustine, Florida in 1883. Flagler found the city charming, but the hotel facilities and transportation systems inadequate. He recognized Florida's potential to attract out-of-state visitors, though Flagler remained on the board of directors of Standard Oil. He gave up his day-to-day involvement in the firm in order to pursue his Florida interests. When Flagler returned to Florida in 1885, he began building a grand St. Augustine hotel, the Ponce de Leon Hotel. Flagler realized that the key to developing Florida was a solid transportation system, and consequently purchased the 3-feet narrow-gauge Jacksonville, St. Augustine and Halifax River Railway on December 31, 1885. He also discovered that a major problem facing the existing Florida railway systems was that each operated on different gauge systems, making interconnection impossible. He converted the line to 4 feet 8½ in standard gauge in 1890, and the small operation was incorporated in 1892. The earliest predecessor of the FEC was the narrow gauge St. John's Railway, incorporated in 1858, which constructed a now abandoned line between St. Augustine and Tocoy, a small settlement on the east bank of the St. Johns River, midway between Palatka and Green Cove Springs. In 1883, Henry M. Flagler, now retired from Standard Oil, moved to St. Augustine and built the previously mentioned Ponce de Leon and the Alcazar hotels and purchased the Casa Monica, just east of the Alcazar, changing the name to Cordova. The east coast of Florida was relatively undeveloped at that time, and Flagler found it difficult to obtain the construction materials he needed. His purchase of the U.S.state Railway was intended to make it faster and easier to supply his building projects. The U.S.state Railway served the northeastern portion of the state and was the first operation in the Flagler Railroad system. Before Flagler bought the line, the railroad stretched only between South Jacksonville and St. Augustine and lacked a depot sufficient to accommodate travelers to his St. Augustine resorts. Flagler built a modern depot facility as well as schools, hospitals and churches, systematically revitalizing the largely abandoned historic city. Flagler next purchased 3 additional existing railroads, the St. John's Railway, the St. Augustine and Palatka Railway, and the St. John's and Halifax River Railway, so that he could provide extended rail service on standard gauge tracks. Through the operation of these 3 railroads, by spring 1889, Flagler's system offered service from Jacksonville to Daytona, continuing to develop hotel facilities to entice northern tourists to visit Florida. Flagler bought and expanded the Ormond Hotel, located along the railroad's route north of Daytona in Ormond Beach, beginning in 1892, when landowners south of Daytona petitioned him to extend the railroad 80 miles south. Flagler began laying new railroad tracks. No longer did he follow his traditional practice of purchasing existing railroads and merging them into his growing rail system. Flagler obtained a charter from the state of Florida authorizing him to build a railroad along the Indian River to Miami. and as the railroad progressed southward, cities such as New Smyrna and Titusville began to develop along the tracks. By 1894, Flagler's railroad system reached what is today known as West Palm Beach. Flagler constructed the Royal Poinciana Hotel in Palm Beach overlooking the Lake Worth Lagoon. He also built the Breakers Hotel on the ocean side of Palm Beach and Whitehall, his private 55-room, 60,000-square-foot winter home. The development of these three structures, coupled with railroad access to them, established Palm Beach as a winter resort for the wealthy members of America's Gilded Age. Palm Beach was to be the terminus of the Flagler Railroad, but during 1894 and 1895, severe freezes hit all of central Florida, whereas the Miami area remained unaffected, causing Flagler to rethink his original decision not to move the railroad south of Palm Beach. The fabled Vic Julia Tuttle, one of two main landowners in the Miami area along with the Brickell family, sent orange blossoms to Flagler to prove to him that Miami, unlike the rest of the state, was unaffected by the frost isn't true. The fact is that Mrs. Tuttle wired Mr. Flagler to advise him that the region around the shores of Biscayne Bay is untouched by the freezes. Mr. Flagler sent his two now famous in Florida history lieutenants, James E. Ingraham and Joseph R. Parrott, to investigate, and they brought boxes of truck and citrus back to Mr. Flagler, who then wired Mrs. Tuttle, asking, "Madam, what is it that you propose?" to convince Flagler to continue the railroad to Miami. Both Julia Tuttle and William Brickell offered half of the holdings north and south of the Miami River to Mr. Flagler. Mrs. Tuttle added 50 acres for shops and yards if Mr. Flagler would extend his railroad to the shores of Biscayne Bay and build one of his great hotels. An agreement was made, contracts were signed, and the rest, as it is said, is history. On September 7, 1895, the name of Flagler's system was changed from the Jacksonville Street, Augustine and Indian River Railway Company to the Florida East Coast Railway Company and Incorporated. On April 15, 1896, track reached Biscayne Bay, the site of present-day downtown Miami. At the time, it was a small settlement of less than 50 inhabitants. When the town incorporated, on July 28, 1896, its citizens wanted to honor the man responsible for the city's development by naming it Flagler. He declined the honor, persuading them to retain its old Indian name, Miami. The area was actually previously known as Fort Dallas after the fort built there in 1836 during the Second Seminole War. To further develop the area surrounding the Miami Railroad Station, Flagler dredged a channel, built streets and the Royal Palm Hotel, instituted the first water and power systems, and financed the town's first newspaper, the Metropolis. Flagler was a great visionary, and he can be credited for the development of the entire east coast of Florida. Yet he lacked vision on at least one issue. He felt that Miami would never be more than a fishing village. As of 1904, Flagler started what everybody considered a folly: the extension of the FEC to Key West, which would later be known as the Overseas Railway. At the time considered the eighth wonder of the world and surely the most daring infrastructure ever built exclusively with private funds. The first train, a construction engineer's train, arrived in Key West on January 21, 1912, while Mr. Flagler's special train and other passenger trains arrived the next day, January 22, 1912, and that is considered the first day of service on the new route. Constructing the Florida East Coast Railway. The railroad south of West Palm Beach was constructed in phases by the FEC and the predecessor systems. Flagler began his railroad building in 1892. Under Florida's generous land grant laws passed in 1893, 8,000 acres could be claimed from the state for every mile built. Flagler would eventually claim a total in excess of 2 million acres for building the FEC, and land development and trading would become one of his most profitable endeavors. Before it became the FEC, the Jacksonville, St. Augustine and Amp. Indian River was constructing a line southwards from Daytona Beach in 1894. Fort Pierce was reached on January 29, and West Palm Beach on March 22. Further extension southwards did not begin until June 1895, when a favorable deal was signed with Miami area business interests. Fort Lauderdale was reached on March 3 of the following year. By April, the construction reached Biscayne Bay, the largest and most accessible harbor on Florida's east coast. Flagler announced in 1904 that the FEC would be extended 128 miles to Key West over the ocean. However, in 1906, a powerful hurricane killed 135 of Flagler's workers. The over-the-sea extension was completed in 1912, a mere 16 months prior to Flagler's death, at a cost of $50 million and lives of hundreds of workmen. Key West extension never won to rest on his laurels. Flagler next sought perhaps his greatest challenge, the extension of the Florida East Coast Railway to Key West, a city of almost 20,000 inhabitants located 128 miles beyond the end of the Florida Peninsula. Flagler became particularly interested in linking Key West to the mainland after the United States announced in 1905 the construction of the Panama Canal. Key West, the United States' closest deep-water port to the canal, could not only take advantage of Cuban and Latin America trade, but the opening of the canal would allow significant trade possibilities with the West. The construction of the Overseas Railroad required many engineering innovations as well as vast amounts of labor and monetary resources. At one time during construction, 4,000 men were employed. During the 7-year construction, 3 hurricanes threatened to halt the project. Despite the hardships, the final link of the Florida East Coast Railway was completed in 1912. On January 22 of that year, a proud Henry Flagler rode the first passenger train into Key West, marking the completion of the railroad's oversea connection to Key West and the linkage by railway of the entire east coast of Florida. One of the reasons Flagler built the Key West extension was at the time of its conception, Key West was a major coaling station for ship traffic between South America and New York. Flagler thought it would be profitable for coal to be brought by railroad to Key West for coaling those ships. By the time the railroad was finished in 1912, though, range had been extended on the ships to such a degree that Key West was no longer a stopover for coal. FEC through the years. The Florida Overseas Railroad, also known as the Key West extension of the Florida East Coast Railway, was heavily damaged and partially destroyed in the Labor Day hurricane of 1935. The Florida East Coast Railway was financially unable to rebuild the destroyed sections, and the line was cut back to Florida City. The roadbed and remaining bridges of the extension were sold to the state of Florida, which built the Overseas Highway to Key West, using much of the remaining railway infrastructure. A rebuilt Overseas Highway taking an alignment that closely follows the Overseas Railroad's original routing, continues to provide a highway link to Key West, ending at the southernmost point in the continental United States. The stock market crash of 1929 and Great Depression were harsh on the FEC. The railroad declared bankruptcy and was in receivership by September 1931, 18 years after Flagler's death. Bus service began to be substituted for trains on the branches in 1932. Streamliners plied the rails between 1939 and 1963, including the Champion and the Florida Special, jointly operated with the Atlantic Coast Line. Adding to the woes was the Cuban embargo. During the Great Depression, Edward Ball, who controlled the Alfred I. DuPont Testamentary Trust, bought a majority ownership of FEC, buying its bonds on the open market, allowing the FEC to emerge from bankruptcy following protracted litigation with a group of the company's other bondholders, led by S.A. Lynch and associated with the Atlantic Coast Line, which had proposed an alternate plan of reorganization. The same year, a labor contract negotiation turned sour. Ball was determined to save the railroad from the bankruptcy that had continued for more than a decade. Ball was certain that if the company didn't become profitable, the equipment and track would deteriorate to the point where some lines would become unsafe or unusable and require partial abandonment. Ball fought ferociously for the company's right to engage in its own contract negotiations with the railroad unions rather than accept an industry-wide settlement that would traditionally contain feather bedding and wasteful work rules. This led to a prolonged work stoppage by non-operating unions beginning January 23, 1963, and whose picket lines were honored by the operating unions. Because the strike was by the non-operating unions, a federal judge ordered the railroad to continue observing the work rules, while the railroad was free to change the work rules for the operating unions, who were technically not on strike and thus had no standing in the federal court regarding the strike. Ball's use of replacement workers to keep the railroad running during the strike led to violence by strikers that included shootings and bombings. Eventually, federal intervention helped quell the violence, and the railroad's right to operate during the strike with replacement workers was affirmed by the United States Supreme Court. As the strike continued, the FEC took numerous steps to improve its physical plant, installed various forms of automation, and drastically cut labor costs. Most of the nation's other railroads did not match these achievements for several years. Some still had not. As of 2010, passenger service became an issue in Florida during the early years of the labor strike, which essentially lasted 14 years, from 1963 to 1977. At the insistence of the city of Miami, which had long fought to get rid of the tracks in the downtown section just north of the county courthouse, Miami's wooden-constructed downtown passenger terminal was demolished by November 1963. Although a new station was planned at near 36th Street and near 2nd Avenue, it was never built. Further, while freight trains were operated with non-union and supervisory crews, passenger runs were not reinstated until August 2, 1965, after the city of Miami sued and the Florida courts ruled that the FEC corporate charter required both coach and first-class passenger services to be offered. In response, FEC sold parlor car seating for first-class accommodations in the rear lounge section of a tavern lounge observation car. This new state-mandated passenger service consisted of a single diesel locomotive and two streamlined passenger cars, which, in addition to the operating crew, were staffed by a passenger service agent and a coach attendant, who were non-operating. The mini streamliner operated all of the way across three previously observed crew districts. Following the letter of the law, the train carried no baggage, remains, mail or express, honored no interline tickets or passes, and the only food service was a boxed lunch. On-board beverage service was limited to soft drinks and coffee, without a station in Miami. The 1950s-era station in North Miami became the southern terminus. The service operated 6 days a week until it was finally discontinued on July 31, 1968. In 1979, the FEC FEC's main line was cut back to its current terminus in downtown Miami when a 9.5-mile segment of the main line between there and Kendall was sold to Miami-Dade Transit, who then built the southern half of Miami's Metro Rail system on the former right-of-way. The rest of the former main line from Kendall south to Homestead and Florida City would remain until 1989, which could still be accessed via the freight bypass through Hialeah. The segment of the main line has since become the South Miami-Dade Busway. Later, after 23 years under Bull, Raymond Wyckoff took the helm on May 30, 1984. In March 2005, Robert Anastas stepped down as CEO of Florida East Coast Industries after a 4-year stint, allowing Adolfo Henriquez to assume the position, with John D. McPherson, a longtime railroad man, continuing as president of the railway itself. By this time, the railroad had long since made peace with its workers. In late 2007, in a move surprising to many employees and railroad industry observers alike, the FEC was purchased by the principal investors, who also control shortline railroad operator Rail America. John Giles was named chairman, and David Rowell was named president. Both men were also principals with major responsibilities at Rail America as well, although the ownership of FEC and Rail America were not linked corporately, and the spin-off of Rail America as a publicly traded company did not include FEC. In May 2010, James Hertwig was named as president and chief executive officer of the company effective July 1, 2010. Hertwig had recently retired from CSX, most recently having served as president of CSX Intermodal, one of CSX's major operating units.